Okay, everybody. So we'll just keep this pretty brief going into this last section. We talked a little bit about John Brown, and there's all of these, references to him. You can see this is one that was painted much later, but this idea of how to represent him and what is his legacy, that's really just kind of note, he's on our timeline in a sense in two places. One earlier in Bleeding Kansas, and that's kind of what we're talking about now. And then ultimately, he will be executed for the raid on Harper's Ferry, which is a lot closer to 1860, which is the start of the U.S. Civil War. So if we go to a little bit more with Bleeding Kansas, we actually do get two competing constitutions that are proposed and submitted to Congress. So the Topeka Constitution and the Lecompton Constitution, one is pro-slavery and one is anti-slavery, right? And of course, neither of these will pass through both houses, but there's this weirdness about popular sovereignty, because ultimately, what will happen if this just kind of continually repeats in state after state after state. So the kind of nature of the Civil War maybe happens, a lot earlier in Kansas and Nebraska. It's kind of like the writing is on the wall for what the Civil War is going to look like. One of the things that we see is a demise of the Whig Party, which was really created in the time period around the 1820s with Andrew Jackson. There really is a oppositional group that joins up with the Whigs that becomes like the anti-Jackson grouping, and this particular kind of grouping doesn't really hold together throughout the 1850s. So we get like Northern Whigs, Southern Whigs, and these particular groups are going to take on, different roles. So some folks will end up supporting popular sovereignty and some will not. And even if they're not necessarily abolitionists, we are going to get some Whigs in this like new Republican Party. Okay, so the Republican Party gets founded in 1854. It is much more leaning toward free soil rather than an abolitionist party, although there are abolitionists who do become part of the Republican Party. It's like kind of a minority strain within the Republican Party. And this is very much going to be a sectional party. And when we say sectionalism, we're really talking about kind of this regional, very focused on the slavery topic. So there is kind of a regional sense to the way people are voting as a bloc. So this sectionalism in this case is like a coalition of, Northern Whigs and Free Soil Democrats are going to merge together into this, Republican Party. By 1856, we have the words of Senator Charles Sumner and the response from Representative Brooks, because Sumner makes a lot of reference to Pierce Butler, and Preston Brooks is the nephew of Pierce Butler, and so we looked at a source that addressed this a little bit. The speech by Charles Sumner is called The Crime Against Kansas, and there's a lot of references, a lot of allusions to things that make points. And we looked at, an excerpt of this speech. This is really a fiery speech, a tirade that is delivered by one politician against another. So if you ever hear this word, a philippic, that's kind of what this is. It's lengthy. He is going to say, that the senator from South Carolina has read many books of chivalry, believes himself a chivalrous knight with sentiments of honor and courage. There is all these references to, kind of this Southern chivalry, this notion of like honor being a Southern value. And of course, Sumner will end up suggesting that Pierce Butler is very hypocritical. Okay, and so some of the language from the text is on the screen. There's a few parts here, but he does say I tell the senator that Kansas, welcomed as a free state, will be a ministering angel to the republic, when South Carolina, in the cloak of darkness, which she hugs, lies howling. So, kind of really a lot of these references of the evilness of slavery. So this is what it looks like in the paper, the crimes against Kansas. Sumner had this printed, and people at this time, read pamphlets. So this type of speech would be available for people to read, and it's distributed all over the North. And then, of course, we know that there are all these representations of Preston Brooks coming at Sumner essentially with a cane, and this becomes very much a issue in Congress. Preston Brooks is not removed from Congress. He actually resigns, but he's censured first, and that's what this slide is about. He resigns, so Preston Brooks resigns, and he decides he's no longer a member. He does get vilified in the North. So in the North, Preston Brooks is like depicted as kind of some type of, monster gone mad, who is taking on, and it's kind of interesting too. We've seen our own society really afflicted by a great deal of political violence. So society reacts, with horror to this political violence. In the South, Preston Brooks receives a whole bunch of canes, people send it to him because it's a reference to how much he is a hero in the South. And we don't see Franklin Pierce anymore. He's actually not renominated for a second term. And, just in reference to a couple of other things that are also kind of part of the time period of the 1850s, there's a great deal of industrial change, especially in the North. And this has brought a great number of immigrants to the United States. So one of the bigger times of immigration is in the 1840s and 1850s into the 1860s. There's another huge peak in the turn of the century, the late 1900s, like with Italians and Russian Jews and Greeks. But in the 1840s period, we see a variety of different groups in the West Coast, especially Chinese immigrants and Irish and some German immigrants in the East Coast. And there's a lot of references that are derogatory toward immigrants at this time. So we get a lot of political movements that are nativist, really anti-immigrant, and that's just something to kind of be aware of, and it's very connected to Northern industrialism. Okay. This is the nativism, sorry, nativism. There's a Know Nothing Party, the American Party. They're very anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. There's a lot of references to Irish immigrants, for example, drinking alcohol, and so lots and lots of stereotyping of immigrant groups and things like that. So the Know Nothing Party is like a nickname of the American Party, but it is kind of a strain of politics, and so you have some alternative types of political things. Not everything is being defined necessarily by slavery, although that's very much a part of it. By 1856, and now we have the Republican Party in the fray. Fremont, who is someone who kind of comes out of California, runs. He doesn't win, but he's actually fairly close. So very quickly, the Republican Party kind of rises, and we see James Buchanan become the president in 1856. So we have a Democrat in political office at the time that the Civil War is, kind of the eve of the Civil War. We get a sense of some of this election. This is really just suggesting this is supposed to be Fremont. He's got his leg, he's stuck in the mud, he's kind of stuck in abolitionism. He might not necessarily be abolitionist, but he's kind of, according to this cartoonist, brought down by some of the abolitionists who are extremists, in some of the eyes of the public. This is Fillmore, so another political leader who's kind of taking aim at Buchanan, and Buchanan runs away with the entirety of the election. So it's kind of how Buchanan wins, basically. He's got he doesn't win the majorities, but he's got a little more popularity than the other candidates, okay? James Buchanan We see, of course, the sectional turmoil is going to get worse. By the last few years, a couple of things that happen, the Dred Scott decision, the Lincoln Douglas debates, and John Brown's raid. These all happen just before, in 1860, Lincoln is elected president. The Dred Scott case, and we talked about this a little bit in classes in 1857. Dred Scott lived with his master in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory for 4 years. He actually marries a free woman, and he gets a group of people who are kind of advocating for his freedom. So he's not like alone in his call for freedom. He has a whole group of abolitionists that are interested in supporting him. So he claims that he should be a free man. The decision is, very significant and creates a huge response. People who are Black Americans, including Dred Scott, can't be citizens. In fact, the court basically says he doesn't have standing to sue. He's got no eligibility to even put in the suit. It also says Congress basically can't forbid slavery. So, in other words, the Missouri Compromise was like kind of found unconstitutional by the Dred Scott case because if no slave can be, free if they're in a free state, then what's to stop anybody from bringing enslaved persons to any free state? And then, there goes the free state. So there is this sense after Dred Scott that abolitionism is kind of fleeting and doesn't have any stand. Okay. The judicial activism is very, very much kind of at play here. And we do see the judicial branch at this time, led by Taney, as being very reflective of slave power and Southern power. This slave power idea, the idea that once the West becomes slave states, that there will be slave power or Southern political power in all of the branches of government, creates almost like a conspiracy level fear in the North. So some people who maybe not be morally opposed to slavery fear slave power, and that creates kind of additional groups of people who are moving into what's kind of becoming a little bit more of not necessarily a completely abolitionist camp, but the Republican Party will stand for moving slavery only in the South and ensuring that the Western territories will not include a slave state. So this becomes very much about, this new territory that really kicks off the decade. The Lincoln Douglas debates we also talked about, and there's many of these. There's several debates. This is very much about, this Republican Party that ensures that there will not be slavery in the West. And Lincoln kind of plays this balancing act of not trying to be, he wants to appeal to a broad number of people in the public. So he's certainly not abolitionist, and a lot of historians would argue he wasn't abolitionist. It's something that he maybe becomes more convinced of when he's president, especially when we think of, like, I think Brandon in class mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation. Some historians will argue that that comes about when it is useful to use previously enslaved persons in war, right? So, individuals who were enslaved also can become, assets once the war had occurred. So there's all kinds of ways to assess Lincoln's decisions. You can include moral arguments and how much that was driving his decision making, but there's also maybe other things also at play. Douglas won the Senate election, won the Lincoln Douglas debates, but of course, Lincoln does kind of become a national figure. Closer to 1860, prior to becoming the candidate, he will deliver some very significant speeches. So, Lincoln kind of has this like launching right before 1860. Even so, it wasn't a given that he was going to be the candidate in 1860. But, he does challenge Douglas with the notion of the Freeport Doctrine, this idea of, could popular sovereignty actually work in light of the Dred Scott decision. And, Douglas doesn't really have a good answer, out of that particular enigma. Lincoln does give his House divided speech around this same time. So during the Lincoln Douglas debates, and the House divided speech had really suggested that, and it's very much about the Dred Scott case, that, you can't have half of the states slave and half of the states free. It's either going to be all of one or all of the other. And to some degree, this becomes a challenge to Southern slave power. So Lincoln, as a politician, may not be making speeches about the immorality of slavery, but he's threatening to the South. Okay. And this is where we see John Brown's raid. He is executed for treason. Okay. So I will stop it there because I think you get the general idea. I'll put this slide up here. This is the 1860 presidential election. You can see that Lincoln, who is in the peach color, not the orange, but the peach color. There are a few different things that happen going into the 1860 election. The Democratic Party implodes, and Douglas ends up leaving the Democratic primary, and he runs kind of his own like northern there's like northern Democrats, there's southern Democrats. So we get a southern Democrat candidate, we get a northern Democrat candidate. We'll see Douglas win maybe 2 states, but that's about it. And Lincoln wins a good part of the North and a lot of the electoral votes, although not South Jersey, notice. That goes to Douglas, so interesting. But in any case, the presidential election goes to Lincoln, who's not even on the ballot in the South. He's just not even on the ballot. He's not even an option. And then, of course, as soon as the election of 1860 happens, we see the Deep South, not all Southern states, but the Deep South will start to secede. Okay. Be well. I hope this helps. I'll see you on next time I see you. I'm not sure when I'm going to see you. Be well.